My name is Alara Whitmore, a 34-year-old litigation paralegal who had been raised to keep everything running smoothly while quietly absorbing whatever damage my family refused to acknowledge. My younger brother, Nolan Whitmore, had always been the center of Mom's admiration and Dad's investment, the one whose mistakes were reframed as potential, while my discipline was treated as obligation and my pain was dismissed as overreaction. Mom praised Nolan's recklessness as charm, and Dad covered his failures with money and silence, while I was expected to be composed, useful, and endlessly forgiving, even when it meant shrinking myself to fit their comfort. And when I sat in family court and heard my mother defend my husband instead of me, softening his violence into stress while my evidence lay in a folder between us, I realized they had chosen him long before I ever chose to leave. The first time I understood how completely I had been replaced did not happen in private, or behind closed doors where denial could soften the edges of truth, but in a courtroom where everything was supposed to be measured, recorded, and weighed with some version of fairness that people still believed in. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above us, casting a pale, almost indifferent glow across polished wood benches and neatly stacked case files, while strangers shifted in their seats, waiting for their own lives to be dissected in front of a judge who would never know them beyond documents and testimony. My attorney leaned toward me with quiet precision, her voice steady as she explained the order of proceedings and the importance of staying composed. But even then I was not afraid of Grant, not really, because I had already learned how to survive him inside a home that no longer felt like mine. What I had not prepared for was my own mother standing on the opposite side. When Mom took the stand, she did not look at me first, and that absence of acknowledgement cut deeper than anything she eventually said, because it confirmed that I was no longer even worthy of confrontation in her eyes. She adjusted her coat with familiar grace, the same practiced movement she used at charity events, and began speaking in a calm, reasonable tone that had always made her sound trustworthy to people who did not know how carefully she chose what to leave out. She told the court that Grant had been under pressure, that marriage was complicated, that I had a tendency to hold on to things longer than necessary, and each phrase was crafted with enough softness to disguise the violence it erased. When my attorney asked whether she had reviewed the medical report documenting my injuries, Mom admitted she had, then tilted her head slightly and said that sometimes context matters more than marks, as if bruises required interpretation before they could be believed. Across the aisle, Grant lowered his eyes at exactly the right moment, his posture controlled, his expression restrained, and I could see how easily a stranger might mistake him for a man enduring unfair accusation, instead of the architect of everything I had spent months documenting. He wore the Navy suit I had paid for with overtime hours and freelance work, and the detail struck me with a clarity that felt almost detached, as though I were watching a scene I had already left, rather than one I was still trapped inside. The judge nodded, taking notes, absorbing the version of events that painted me as reactive, and Grant as patient. And for a brief moment, I felt the old instinct rise in my chest, the one that told me to explain, to clarify, to fix the narrative before it hardened into something permanent. I didn't move. Dad remained seated behind them, hands folded, expression neutral in the way that had always allowed him to exist without choosing sides, and I realized that his silence had never been accidental, but had always been a decision shaped by comfort. He did not interrupt Mom, did not correct her, did not even shift in his seat when she minimized what had been done to me. And that stillness said more than any defense ever could have. Nolan wasn't there, but his absence carried its own weight, because I knew exactly what he would have said if he had bothered to show up, and it would not have been for me. In my family, loyalty had always followed convenience. The realization did not arrive all at once, but unfolded slowly, like a truth I had been circling for years without allowing myself to fully see, and in that courtroom, surrounded by strangers and paperwork and quiet judgment, it finally settled into something undeniable. This was not a misunderstanding. It was alignment. Mom found me in the courthouse hallway before my attorney could even finish organizing the next set of filings, her heels clicking against the tile with that familiar urgency she reserved for moments when she needed to regain control of a narrative that was slipping out of her hands. She reached for my wrist with a gentle pressure that would have looked caring to anyone passing by. then leaned closer and told me in a lowered voice that I needed to stop letting this spiral any further because people were starting to talk, and once things became public, they could not be contained again. I could smell her perfume, the same soft floral scent she had worn since I was a child. And for a brief second it almost pulled me backward into a version of myself that still believed comfort and harm could not come from the same person. Then she said that if I kept pushing, I would destroy not just my marriage, but the family's reputation, and the sentence landed exactly where she intended it to, between guilt and obedience. Dad joined us moments later, standing slightly behind her as though positioning himself outside the line of conflict while still reinforcing it. And he spoke in that controlled, measured tone he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable enough that disagreement felt like overreaction. He told me that court proceedings had a way of escalating unnecessarily, that lawyers benefited from prolonging conflict, and that perhaps it would be wiser to consider a private settlement where everyone could walk away with dignity intact, which was his way of suggesting that truth was negotiable if it made things quieter. I asked him, carefully, whether dignity also included the money that had been transferred out of my account without consent, or the medical report Mom had just dismissed under oath, and for a moment his expression shifted, not toward concern, but toward irritation at the complication. He said those things could be interpreted differently, as if facts were flexible enough to accommodate comfort. Nolan called while I was still standing there, his name lighting up my phone screen like a reminder of a conversation I already knew the ending to. And when I answered, his voice carried that casual impatience he had always used when my problems interfered with his day. He told me Mom had updated him, that I needed to think strategically instead of emotionally, and that dragging everything through court made me look unstable, which would only make things worse in the long run. I asked him whether he had read any of the documents I sent, the account records, the timestamps, the medical report, and he exhaled softly before saying that I had always been good at building a case for myself, but that didn't mean the situation was as extreme as I was making it sound. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Grant had called him the night before and seemed genuinely worried about me, which was apparently enough to outweigh everything I had lived through. I could feel the pressure building around me, not in raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, coordinated insistence that I was the variable that needed to be corrected, the one disrupting a system that functioned more smoothly when I absorbed discomfort without resistance. Mom's hand was still lightly holding my wrist, Dad's presence still anchoring the conversation in controlled authority, and Nolan's voice still filtering through the phone with the confidence of someone who had never been required to prove his version of reality. They were not asking me to reconsider. They were asking me to submit. Mom softened her tone then, shifting seamlessly into concern as she told me that she understood I was hurt, that no one was denying I had been through something difficult, but that sometimes strength meant choosing peace over being right, and she emphasized the word peace as if it were a reward I could earn by agreeing with her. She said Grant was willing to work something out, that continuing the case would only prolong stress, and that I needed to think about my future instead of clinging to what had already happened. I watched her carefully as she spoke, noticing how every sentence was constructed to sound supportive while redirecting responsibility back toward me. And for the first time, I recognized the pattern not as misunderstanding, but as strategy. Dad nodded in agreement, adding that relationships were complicated and that no one outside the marriage could fully understand what had happened, which was a subtle way of invalidating everything I had already documented without directly contradicting it. He suggested that perhaps I had reacted too quickly by leaving, that distance sometimes magnified problems, and that reconciliation, or at least a quieter resolution, would reflect better on everyone involved. His focus was never on what had been done to me, only on how it looked. It always had been. The hallway felt narrower the longer they spoke, as if the space itself were tightening around the version of reality they were trying to impose. And I realized with a clarity that left no room for negotiation that this was not a conversation I could win, because it was not designed to be won. It was designed to wear me down, to make resistance feel exhausting enough that surrender would start to resemble relief. That had always been their method. I slowly pulled my wrist free from Mom's hand. Not abruptly, not with anger, but with a calm precision that surprised even me. And I met her eyes in a way I had rarely allowed myself to before, without softening, without translating my thoughts into something easier for her to accept. I told her that I had already spent years choosing peace over being right, and all it had done was make it easier for people to take what I did not defend. I told Dad that dignity without truth was just silence dressed up to look respectable, and that I was no longer interested in maintaining appearances at my own expense. Then I ended the call with Nolan without responding, because there was nothing left to explain to someone who had already decided not to understand. Mom's expression shifted, just slightly, as if she had expected resistance, but not this kind of stillness. And for a brief moment, I saw something unfamiliar there. Not guilt, not regret, but the first hint that her usual methods might not work the way they always had. Dad looked at me as though recalculating, measuring whether pushing further would produce the outcome he preferred or risk escalating things beyond his control. Neither of them spoke. I picked up my bag, feeling the weight of the documents inside it, along with the smooth metal of my grandmother's pen, and stepped back just enough to create space between us that could not be closed with a gentle touch or a carefully chosen sentence. I told them I would see them in court. The realization did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden revelation, but in the quiet stillness of my apartment later that night, when the absence of their voices made it impossible to ignore my own. The radiator clicked softly in uneven intervals. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across the floor, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to sit without explaining, without defending, without preparing for the next argument that would twist truth into something negotiable. I opened my laptop, not out of panic or habit, but with a clarity that felt almost surgical, and began reviewing every document I had collected, not to convince anyone anymore, but to understand exactly what I had been surviving. That was the moment everything shifted. I saw patterns I had previously tried to justify, transactions that aligned too precisely with moments of conflict, account permissions altered within hours of arguments, and small technical details that only someone with deliberate intent would have arranged so carefully. Grant had not been careless. He had been methodical. The transfers from the business savings account, the recovery email that was not mine, the login alerts that stopped appearing when I questioned them. All of it formed a structure that could not be explained away by stress or miscommunication, no matter how many times my family tried to soften it. It wasn't chaos. It was design. Denise had mentioned earlier that day that we could request a forensic accounting review, but at the time it had felt like another legal step in a process already heavy with procedure, another delay, another expense, another risk. Now it felt different. It felt necessary. I drafted an email to her outlining what I had found, attaching timestamps, screenshots, and a summary of inconsistencies that I had previously been too overwhelmed to organize with this level of precision. My hands did not shake while I typed. My breathing did not quicken. I was not reacting anymore. I was deciding. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, when I considered what it would look like to accept what my family wanted. To withdraw. To settle quietly. To let Grant keep what he had taken and walk away with something that resembled peace. At least from the outside. I imagined the relief on Mom's face, the approval in Dad's silence, the casual validation in Nolan's tone, and I understood how easily my life could slide back into something familiar if I allowed it. That version of peace would cost me less conflict. It would also cost me myself. I closed the laptop for a second and reached into my bag, pulling out my grandmother's pen, running my thumb along the engraved ivy leaves, as if grounding myself in something that did not shift depending on who was watching. She had told me once that there would be moments when the hardest thing was not speaking, but choosing not to speak until it mattered, and I had never fully understood what she meant until now. Silence, used correctly, was not surrender. It was positioning. When I opened the laptop again, I wasn't thinking about winning in the way my family understood winning, with visible validation and immediate outcomes that could be pointed to and displayed. I was thinking about leverage, about timing, about building something strong enough that it would not require their belief to hold. I emailed Denise confirming that I wanted to proceed with the forensic audit, that I was prepared to authorize the additional costs, and that I would provide anything else needed to move quickly. Then I added one more line, asking whether we could request access logs tied to the recovery email Grant had used, because I had a suspicion it would lead somewhere he had not expected anyone to look. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating the ceiling before fading into the distance, and the quiet returned in a way that no longer felt empty. I realized then that I had spent years trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me, and that leaving Grant had only been the first step in a process that was much larger than a marriage ending. This was about something deeper, something that had been shaping my decisions long before I ever met him. I picked up my phone and saw that Mom had sent another message, longer this time, softer in tone, carefully written to sound like concern instead of pressure, and for the first time since she started reaching out, I did not feel the urge to respond immediately or explain myself in a way that might soften her reaction. I read it once, then set the phone down without replying. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed her to agree with me in order to move forward. That was the moment I stopped asking for permission. The first bill from the forensic accounting firm arrived 3 days later in a plain white envelope that looked far too ordinary for the kind of decision it forced me to make, and I remember standing in my narrow kitchen with the paper unfolded in my hands, reading the total twice, as if the number might change if I looked at it differently. The initial retainer was $8,500, due within 10 business days, with additional hourly charges that could push the total well past anything I had budgeted for when I first left Grant. And for a moment, the practical weight of it pressed down harder than any argument my family had made in that courthouse hallway. My checking account had just over $11,200 left after rent, deposits, and basic expenses, and committing to this meant stripping away the last layer of financial safety I had been quietly relying on. There would be no cushion after this. I sat at the small table by the window, the one I had assembled myself with a screwdriver that kept slipping in my hand because I refused to call anyone for help, and I let the reality settle without rushing to soften it into something easier to accept. This was not a symbolic stand. It was a measurable risk with consequences that would not disappear if I regretted them later. If the audit found nothing actionable, if the court dismissed it, if Grant managed to reframe everything again with the same calm confidence he used in public, I would be left with less money, more pressure, and no guarantee that anything had changed except my level of exhaustion. That was the truth. I called Denise anyway, and when she answered, I could hear the faint background noise of another client's case unfolding somewhere behind her, voices overlapping in that familiar legal rhythm that had once felt routine to me, and now felt like a world I was stepping into from a completely different position. I told her I had reviewed the estimate, that I understood the risk, and that I wanted to proceed, and there was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted just long enough for me to realize she was recalibrating how she saw me. She said we would move quickly, that she would file the motion by the end of the week, and that I should prepare for pushback because requests like this tended to make people nervous when they had something to hide. I told her I was no longer worried about making anyone comfortable. The following weeks were not dramatic in the way people imagine when they think about change. Because there were no sudden victories, no satisfying confrontations, no visible shifts that could be pointed to as proof that I had made the right decision, only a steady accumulation of small, difficult realities that I had to navigate alone. I worked longer hours at the firm, taking on additional case prep and late-night document reviews to stabilize my income, and I picked up freelance assignments on weekends, drafting legal summaries for attorneys who needed quick turnaround work, and did not ask questions about why I accepted every deadline they offered. Sleep became inconsistent, meals became functional, and the apartment, which had once felt like a fragile kind of safety, began to feel like a place I passed through rather than lived in. Independence was not peaceful. It was demanding. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic filtering through the thin walls, and I would calculate numbers in my head with a precision that bordered on obsession, tracking every expense, every incoming payment, every projected cost of the audit, as it expanded beyond the initial estimate. I knew exactly how many weeks I could sustain this pace before something would have to give, and I refused to let that something be my decision to pursue the truth. Doubt did not disappear during those moments. It became quieter, more controlled, but it was still there, asking whether I had misjudged the situation, Whether my family had been right in ways I did not want to admit, whether walking away would have been easier. Easier was no longer the metric. Mom continued to send messages, carefully spaced, carefully worded, each one attempting to reopen a conversation without acknowledging what had actually been said in that courthouse hallway, and I read them all without responding. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I understood now that engagement was the mechanism through which she maintained influence. Dad called once, leaving a voicemail that lasted just under a minute, his voice measured and neutral, as he said he hoped I was taking care of myself, and that the situation did not need to become more complicated than it already was, which was his way of expressing concern without ever addressing cause. Nolan sent a single text asking whether I had calmed down yet, followed by a second message with a link to an article about mediation, as if forwarding information counted as support. I deleted nothing. I answered none of it. The audit began quietly, without ceremony, without the visible markers that people associate with progress, and for the first time since leaving Grant, I found myself moving through my days with a different kind of focus. One that was not driven by fear or reaction, but by a steady, deliberate intention that did not require anyone else's approval. I gathered documents, organized timelines, cross-referenced communications, and provided everything the accounting team requested with a level of detail that reflected not only my training, but the months I had spent living inside the consequences of someone else's decisions. Every record I submitted felt like a piece of something larger I was building, even if I could not yet see its full shape. There were moments, brief and unexpected, when the loneliness pressed in harder than the financial strain or the uncertainty, usually in small, ordinary situations that carried echoes of a life I no longer had, like standing in line at a grocery store and noticing couples debating what to cook for dinner, or hearing laughter through the wall from the apartment next door while I heated leftovers in silence. Those moments did not break me, but they did remind me that choosing independence came with a cost that extended beyond money or court outcomes into the quieter spaces where connection used to live. I let those feelings exist without trying to argue them away. They were part of the process. One evening, as I was reviewing a new set of requests from the forensic team, I noticed a detail I had not paid enough attention to before. Something small but consistent across multiple records that suggested access to my accounts had not only been intentional, but coordinated with an external system I had not previously identified. The pattern was subtle, but once I saw it, it was impossible to ignore. And the realization settled into me with the same controlled clarity I had felt the night I decided to move forward with the audit. This was bigger than I thought. I leaned back in my chair, the dim light from the desk lamp casting a narrow circle across the documents in front of me, and allowed myself a single, steady breath before reaching for my phone to document the finding and prepare the next set of questions for Denise and the accounting team. There was still no guarantee of what the outcome would be, no certainty that this path would lead to the kind of resolution most people would recognize as success. But for the first time in a long time, I was not measuring progress by how others responded to me. I was measuring it by how firmly I stood inside my own decisions. I wasn't going back. The first sign that everything was about to change did not come from a dramatic courtroom moment or a sudden confession, but from a quiet email Denise forwarded to me on a gray Tuesday morning, flagged with a single line that read, "You need to see this before we file." I opened the attachment at my desk, the office around me moving in its usual rhythm of phone calls and muted conversations. And what I saw was not just confirmation of what I had suspected, but something far more deliberate than I had prepared myself for. The forensic report had mapped a sequence of transactions, access logs, and recovery pathways that linked Grant's activity not only to my accounts, but to a secondary holding account registered under a shell LLC I had never heard of, created less than 3 weeks after we got married. It wasn't a mistake. It was infrastructure. The report outlined how funds had been routed through staggered transfers designed to avoid triggering alerts, how login recovery had been redirected through an alias tied to that LLC, and how the timing of each movement corresponded almost exactly with moments when I had questioned him, as if every challenge I raised had been quietly anticipated and managed in advance. One section included IP logs that placed access from two locations simultaneously on multiple occasions, suggesting that Grant had not been working alone, and as I read through the details, I felt something settle into place that had been shifting inside me for months. This wasn't just control, it was strategy. Denise called within minutes of me opening the file, her tone sharper than I had ever heard it, no longer measured in the careful neutrality she usually maintained. And she told me that this changed the case entirely, that we were no longer arguing interpretation but presenting evidence of coordinated financial misconduct. She explained that we would file an emergency motion to freeze the linked accounts, request full disclosure of the LLC's ownership, and push for sanctions based on the pattern of concealed transfers, and although she did not say it directly, I could hear the underlying shift in her confidence. This was no longer defensive. This was leverage. I left the office early that day, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed space to absorb what this meant without the background noise of other people's lives unfolding around me. And as I walked through the city streets, I noticed how different everything felt, even though nothing visible had changed. The same buildings stood, the same traffic moved, the same gray sky hung overhead, but the weight I had been carrying had shifted, redistributed in a way that made it easier to breathe. For months, I had been reacting, defending, explaining. Now, for the first time, I had something that did not require explanation. The motion was filed within 48 hours, and the response came faster than anyone expected, because people who operate in controlled environments rarely anticipate being exposed in ways they cannot immediately contain. Grant's attorney requested an emergency conference, citing procedural concerns and misinterpretation of data, but the urgency in the filing said more than the language itself ever could have. When the court granted a temporary freeze on the identified accounts pending further review, Denise sent me a brief message that simply read, "It's starting." I stared at those two words longer than I expected to. Mom called that evening. Her voice was softer than it had been in weeks, but there was a strain beneath it that she could not fully hide, as though something had disrupted the version of events she had been holding on to, and she was trying to recalibrate before it became visible to others. She said she had heard there were developments, that people were asking questions, and that she wanted to understand what was happening before things got out of hand, which was her way of asking for information without admitting concern. I listened without interrupting, letting her fill the silence the way she always did when she sensed she was losing control of a situation. When she finally paused, I told her that the court had identified financial activity connected to Grant that required further investigation, and that everything would be handled through legal channels moving forward. I did not raise my voice. I did not elaborate. I did not offer reassurance. There was a moment on the line where she seemed to be waiting for something more. Some familiar attempt from me to soften the edges, to explain in a way that would make her comfortable again. I gave her nothing. Dad tried a different approach the next day, calling during my lunch break with a tone that was almost careful, as if he were navigating unfamiliar ground and unsure how to maintain his usual position of quiet authority. He said he had spoken to someone who mentioned serious allegations, that situations like this could escalate quickly, and that I needed to consider the broader consequences before things went too far, which was the closest he had come to acknowledging that something real might be happening. I asked him evenly whether he had considered the consequences when Mom testified against me without addressing the evidence she had already seen, and for once he did not have an immediate response. Nolan's reaction came last, and it was the least controlled of all, arriving as a series of messages that abandoned his usual casual tone in favor of something sharper, more defensive, more revealing than he likely intended. He accused me of overreacting, of trying to ruin people, of turning a private situation into something public and irreversible. And then, in a line that stood out with a clarity that surprised even me, he asked what I expected to gain from all of this. I read that question twice before setting the phone down, because for the first time the answer did not feel complicated. I wasn't trying to gain anything. I was taking it back. The next hearing was scheduled within the week, and as I prepared for it, reviewing the report, organizing timelines, and working with Denise to structure the presentation in a way that would withstand scrutiny, I felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence in the outcome, and everything to do with clarity in my position. I no longer needed to convince my family of anything. I no longer needed them to understand, to agree, or to support me in ways they had already proven they would not. When I stood in that courtroom again, the same fluorescent lights above, the same benches, the same quiet tension in the air, I knew that whatever happened next would not be shaped by how well I explained myself, but by what could no longer be denied. They did not wait for the next hearing to come to me, because once the court froze the accounts, and the first formal notice of investigation circulated through the same social and professional circles my family had spent years carefully maintaining, silence was no longer a strategy they could rely on. The shift was immediate and unmistakable, not in tone alone but in urgency, as though something invisible had been exposed to light and could no longer be contained within the version of events they had constructed. I saw it first in the way Mom's messages changed from measured concern to carefully worded invitations. Then in Dad's voice, when he called without leaving a voicemail. And finally in the unexpected request from Nolan asking if we could talk in person, just us, which was something he had never needed before. They weren't reaching out to understand. They were responding to pressure. Mom arranged the meeting at a restaurant she chose deliberately, one of the places she had always associated with controlled conversations and polished appearances, where lighting was soft enough to blur discomfort and service was attentive enough to prevent silence from becoming noticeable. When I arrived, she was already seated, her posture composed, her expression arranged into something that hovered between concern and restraint, as if she had practiced this version of herself in a mirror before stepping out of the house. Dad sat beside her, hands folded as always, his presence quiet but deliberate, while Nolan leaned back in his chair, with a tension in his shoulders that did not match the casual posture he was trying to maintain. They had come prepared. Mom began by saying she was glad I agreed to meet, that things had escalated faster than anyone expected, and that she believed it was still possible to find a way through this, if we approached it carefully, which was her way of suggesting that the situation was becoming inconvenient rather than unjust. She spoke about misunderstandings, about how legal processes sometimes distorted reality, about how people said things under pressure that did not fully represent what they meant, and although she never directly referenced her testimony, every sentence was constructed to soften its impact without acknowledging its existence. I listened without interrupting, noticing how each word was placed with precision, how every phrase circled the truth without ever touching it. It was familiar. Dad followed, his tone measured, his language structured in the way that had always allowed him to appear reasonable, even when he was asking for something fundamentally unfair. And he said that the situation had reached a point where long-term consequences needed to be considered, not just immediate outcomes. He mentioned reputational damage, professional implications, the way things like this could follow people beyond the courtroom. And although he framed it as concern for me, it was clear that his focus remained on containment. He asked whether I had considered what would happen if this continued publicly, whether there might be value in stepping back before things became irreversible. I understood exactly what he was asking. Nolan's contribution was less controlled, slipping between frustration and something closer to anxiety, as if he had not fully prepared for the reality of the situation now that it was no longer theoretical. He said people were talking, that Grant's name had come up in conversations that did not sound sympathetic, that this was turning into something bigger than a private dispute. And then, almost abruptly, he asked why I hadn't told them how far this would go. The question hung in the air longer than he seemed comfortable with, because it revealed more than he intended. Not about me, but about how little they had ever expected me to push back this far. I let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the balance of the conversation before I responded. Not with anger, not with raised volume, but with a calm that no longer needed their approval to hold its shape. I told them that nothing about this was sudden, that every step had been documented, every concern had been raised, every opportunity for them to stand beside me had been offered long before the court became involved. I reminded Mom, without softening the words, that she had read the medical report before choosing to dismiss it under oath. And I asked Dad whether he remembered the bank statements I had sent weeks earlier, the ones he said could be interpreted differently. Then I looked at Nolan and asked whether he had ever once considered that believing me might have been the simpler, more honest option. Mom's expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough to break the smooth surface she had been maintaining, and for a moment I saw something closer to defensiveness than control. As she responded that she had been trying to keep the situation from becoming destructive, that sometimes people needed to make difficult choices for the greater good, and that she had never intended to hurt me. The words sounded familiar, but they no longer carried the weight they once did, because intention without accountability had become a pattern I could now recognize without questioning myself. Dad remained silent, but his silence felt different this time, less stable, as though he was no longer entirely certain where to position himself. Then Mom shifted. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice in a way that suggested the next part of the conversation was meant to remain contained, even in a public space. And she said that Grant's attorney had reached out, that there was still an opportunity to resolve everything privately, and that if I agreed to withdraw certain claims, the situation could be handled in a way that protected everyone involved. She did not specify what handled meant, but she did not need to, because I understood the implication clearly enough. This was not concern. It was negotiation. Dad nodded almost imperceptibly, reinforcing the offer without stating it outright, while Nolan looked between us with an expression that suggested he was beginning to grasp the gravity of what was being proposed, even if he did not fully understand the mechanics behind it. The three of them, in different ways, were asking me to trade truth for control, to exchange what had been uncovered for a version of events they could manage, to step back just enough that the consequences would never fully reach them. It was the same pattern, only now it was visible. I reached into my bag and rested my hand briefly against the cool metal of my grandmother's pen. Not because I needed to remind myself what I had already decided, but because I wanted to feel something steady in a moment that was designed to destabilize me. Then I looked at them, really looked, without translating their expressions into something easier to accept, without adjusting my response to preserve their comfort. And I told them, clearly and without hesitation, that I would not withdraw anything, that the case would proceed exactly as filed, and that whatever followed would not be shaped by what made them feel protected. The table fell quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause between sentences, but the kind that settles when a familiar dynamic stops working, and no one is quite sure how to rebuild it in real time. Mom's hand tightened slightly around the edge of her glass. Dad's gaze shifted in a way that suggested recalculation, and Nolan looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of recognition, or the first moment he realized I was no longer playing the role he understood. For the first time in that room, they were not guiding the conversation. They were reacting to me. By the time the next hearing arrived, the version of me my family had spent years negotiating with no longer existed. And the difference was not something I needed to announce because it showed in the way I moved, in what I did not explain, and in what I refused to soften. The courtroom felt the same as before. Same pale lighting. Same steady hum of quiet conversations. Same rows of people waiting for decisions that would rearrange their lives. But I no longer entered it with the instinct to be understood. I entered it prepared to stand. That was enough. Grant was already there when I walked in, seated beside his attorney with a tension he could not fully conceal despite the careful control he usually maintained. And for the first time since I had known him, there was something slightly misaligned in the image he presented to the world, as if the structure he relied on had shifted just enough to expose the strain underneath. The freeze on the accounts had done more than limit his access. It had interrupted the quiet confidence he built his behavior around. And although he still held himself with composure, it no longer felt effortless. His attorney shuffled papers more quickly than before, checking notes, adjusting documents, and I could see the small, precise movements of someone recalculating in real time. Denise stood beside me, composed and focused, her presence steady in a way that did not require reassurance, and as the proceedings began, she laid out the findings from the forensic report with a clarity that removed the space for interpretation my family had relied on. She referenced transaction patterns, recovery access logs, and the structure of the LLC that had been used to redirect funds, presenting each detail with documentation that anchored it in something concrete and difficult to dismiss. There was no exaggeration, no emotional appeal, only facts aligned in a way that made denial increasingly fragile. The room shifted. When Grant's attorney attempted to respond, the tone had changed from confident dismissal to controlled mitigation, focusing on technicalities, context, and the possibility of misunderstanding, but the language felt thinner than before, stretched over something it could no longer fully contain. The judge asked pointed questions, not aggressive, but precise enough to cut through the surface, and each answer seemed to narrow the space available for Grant to maneuver. I watched it unfold without interrupting, without leaning forward, without trying to assist in the process that was already moving on its own momentum. I didn't need to. Mom and Dad sat behind him again. But they were not positioned the same way they had been during the first hearing, and the difference was subtle but unmistakable, reflected in the distance between them and the quiet tension in their posture. Mom's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her expression composed but no longer smooth, while Dad's gaze moved more frequently than before, shifting between the judge, the attorneys, and the documents being referenced, as though he were trying to locate a stable version of the situation that no longer existed. They had come expecting control. They found uncertainty. At one point, the judge asked whether there had been any external accounts or entities used to facilitate the transfers. And for a brief moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet anticipation that builds when something unresolved is about to be clarified. Grant's attorney began to answer, referencing the LLC in a way that attempted to frame it as a separate matter. But Denise stepped in with a document already prepared, placing it before the court with a precision that suggested this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. The connection was established. Cleanly. I did not look at my parents then, or at Nolan, who had finally decided to attend, sitting slightly behind them, with an expression that no longer carried the easy certainty he had relied on in earlier conversations. I kept my focus forward, not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to measure my position against their reactions. What was happening in that room did not require their agreement to be real. It never had. When the hearing adjourned for a brief recess, the movement in the courtroom resumed, chairs shifting, voices lowering, people stepping out into the hallway. But the energy felt different, less contained, as though the boundaries that had previously kept everything orderly had been quietly disrupted. Denise leaned toward me and said we had reached a critical point, that the court would likely push for full disclosure and that the next phase would determine how far this extended. And although her words carried the weight of what was still ahead, they also carried something else. Momentum. Mom approached me then, not immediately, but after a few minutes had passed, as if she needed time to adjust before stepping back into proximity. And when she spoke, her voice lacked the controlled softness she had relied on before, replaced instead by something more direct, more urgent, more difficult to disguise. She said this had gone too far, that things were being interpreted in ways that could cause permanent damage, and that I needed to reconsider before it reached a point that could not be undone. The words were familiar. The effect was not. I looked at her without interruption, allowing the silence between us to hold its shape instead of filling it with explanation. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady in a way that did not need to assert itself to be heard. I told her that there had been multiple points where this could have been addressed privately, before evidence became necessary, before the court became involved, before she chose to stand against me in a room where the truth was supposed to matter. I told her that the situation had not gone too far. It had simply reached a place where it could no longer be controlled. Dad stepped closer, his presence quieter but no less deliberate, and he said my name in a way that carried both familiarity and distance, as though he were trying to bridge something without fully acknowledging it, and he asked whether there was still a way to resolve this without continuing down the current path. I understood what he meant, what he was offering, what he was asking for, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of myself that would have accepted that opening just to restore some sense of stability. even if it came at the cost of everything I had already fought to reclaim. That version no longer guided my decisions. I told him no. Not loudly, not emotionally, not with hesitation, just clearly enough that there was no space left to reinterpret it. Nolan didn't speak this time, but I could feel his attention fixed on me in a way that suggested something had shifted for him as well. Not necessarily understanding, but recognition, the realization that I was no longer operating within the boundaries he had always assumed I would stay inside. It did not matter what he thought of that change. It only mattered that it had already happened. When the session resumed, I returned to my seat with the same steady pace, the same controlled focus, the same absence of urgency that had replaced the need to react. And as the judge began outlining the next steps, I felt something settle into place that had been building across every decision I had made since leaving Grant, every document I had submitted, every message I had chosen not to answer. I wasn't asking anymore. I was deciding. The final decision did not arrive with a dramatic pause or a moment designed for reaction, but in the steady, deliberate tone of a judge outlining consequences that had been building long before that day, each word grounded in evidence that no longer required interpretation. The court ordered full financial disclosure, extended the asset freeze, and formally recognized the pattern of concealed transfers tied to the LLC as grounds for further legal action, shifting the case from dispute to accountability in a way that could not be softened by explanation or reframed by careful language. Grant's composure held, but it no longer carried authority. It looked like effort now, like something maintained rather than something inherent. For the first time, the structure he relied on had to answer for itself. I did not react visibly when the ruling was read, not because it lacked significance, but because the moment I had been working toward was never about a single outcome, but about reaching a point where the truth no longer depended on who believed it. Denise touched my arm briefly, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been secured and what would follow, and I gathered my documents with the same measured movements I had used throughout the hearing, aware that what mattered most had already shifted long before this decision was spoken out loud. The courtroom began to empty, voices returning, chairs moving, life resuming in the way it always does after something irreversible has taken place. Mom approached me one last time before I left. Her expression no longer arranged, no longer controlled, but unsettled in a way I had never seen before, as though she were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could no longer coexist. She said my name softly, without the certainty that had always accompanied it, and told me she had not expected things to go this far, that she thought there would still be a way to manage it, to contain it, to keep it within boundaries that made sense to her. There was no accusation in her voice now, only the quiet realization that those boundaries had never belonged to me. Dad stood slightly behind her, his presence less defined than it had been in earlier moments. And when he spoke, it was not with authority, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing a version of me he had not accounted for when he chose silence over support. He said he hoped I understood that everything they had done was meant to protect the family, and although the words followed the same pattern they always had, the conviction behind them was weaker, no longer anchored in certainty. Nolan said nothing at all, his usual confidence replaced by a stillness that suggested he was beginning to understand something he had never needed to question before. I listened to them without interruption, not because I was considering their words, but because I no longer needed to respond to them in the way I once had, translating my decisions into something they could accept, adjusting my truth to preserve connection. I told Mom that there had never been anything to contain, only something to acknowledge, and that the moment she chose not to, she had already stepped outside of whatever version of family she believed she was protecting. I told Dad that protection without truth was not protection at all, and that silence had consequences just as real as action, even if they were easier to ignore in the moment. Then I looked at all three of them and understood, without anger or hesitation, that I was no longer standing inside their expectations. There was no argument after that, no attempt to persuade, no final effort to redirect the outcome into something more comfortable, because the space between us had changed in a way that could not be negotiated back into its previous shape. Mom's hands remained still at her sides. Dad's gaze lowered slightly, and Nolan looked at me as if he were trying to measure something he could no longer define. But none of it reached me in the way it once would have. Their reactions were no longer instructions. They were simply responses. I stepped out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light, the air cool and steady against my skin. And for a moment I paused at the top of the steps. Not to look back, but to recognize the absence of something I had carried for most of my life without realizing its weight. There was no urgency, no need to prove, no instinct to explain myself to anyone waiting behind me or beyond that moment. Only a quiet, grounded clarity that did not shift depending on who stood beside me. The city moved around me, unchanged, indifferent. And for the first time, that indifference felt like freedom. I walked forward without turning around. I no longer needed them to define my worth.